When we switch to the rear arm versions of all these forearm strikes, there are some things that stay the same, only they're in reverse, but there are some things that change. Firstly, the posture is bigger than the lead arm versions. So secondly, it's more powerful, it's got more volume. Thirdly, because the posture is more powerful, it's harder to hit and stop at the centre line. And then fourthly, the centre line itself, as we understand it in relation to the strike, isn't the centre line of our opponent if they were facing directly forwards. It's off at an angle to our own body. And that's because if you go any further than this, you begin to unbalance the posture. So it's exactly the same principle as when we looked at the rear hand elbow in the beginner series, and we learned that, well, for one thing, it unbalances the posture if you turn the elbow too far past the centre line. So it's always off centre. And for two, you start to lose power in the hit and stop because you're squashing your shoulders together too much. So one thing that we're going to learn, or something that your body will teach you naturally if you allow it to, is how to overcome that problem by using a little bit of what we call a sliding set, just to widen the posture. Okay, so just as we've reversed the hand that we're using from lead to rear, so we reverse the context from open to close, moving the rear hip forwards. And if once again we compare this posture to its closest living relative, the rear hook, we can see that it's a much bigger posture. And as with the other exercises, we can see that the hook is one movement. Everything just goes one count of one, whereas the forearm strike, well, we can already begin to see how that's going to phase. The use of close then followed by the widening of the shoulders along the same line. So right hip coming forward in this case, followed in the same direction by the shoulders lengthening. And we need to cultivate our timing so that the hip moves forward and then the shoulders just lengthen along the same line but slightly afterwards. That's going to help create spiral movement in the torso, and that's going to slingshot the hip forwards. However, you can see in this demonstration that I'm already employing a little bit of open into close. So I've reversed everything from the other postures where it was close into open. So just opening the hips a little bit and then adding that into the spiral. Again, we don't necessarily need this. It's a very powerful posture on its own, but what we do need to do is learn how to do that so that we can combine it with other strikes. So for example, if you wanted to do a lead hand hook into this clothesline strike, then we would need the ability to be able to do that. And as we're doing slow motion, let's just double check again the difference between the hook and the forearm strike, and look at the difference in the volume of the posture. And that's also going to make a significant difference in terms of how the posture balances. And remember that there's no perfect posture, there's always compromise. That's why Wang Shengjai emphasizes over and over again that the doctrine of the mean is a key concept in Yiquan theory. We just have to try and find the best balance that we possibly can. So literally in this case, because we've gained more volume and more power, but as a knock-on effect of that, the posture itself is more unstable, the rooting is more unstable. And again, remember Yao Zhongzhen's saying that the point of releasing force is a vulnerability. So there's a few things that we can do to try and mitigate that. The first one is to do it as fast as possible, which is the classic Yiquan solution, but there's a few other things as well. Don't let the dog of intent get out of control and try and convince you to lean forward with the posture, because that will just pull you right off balance. The posture needs to be skewed forward, but nevertheless there's a point of balance down the centre line, and you don't get tempted to go past that to try and improve power. And the reason that it is tempting is because the hit and stop point is not quite on line with the centre line. So you're tempted to move it over to try and compensate to hit the target. Well, that's not the solution. At least not in each one, but you can see how this posture developed in some kinds of southern Wushu. I mean, that's just a fancy version of this, isn't it? Keep the posture neatly up to the hit and stop, as you can see here. You can clearly see that's a very good example of hit and stop. If I do say so myself, you can clearly see the posture. And as we've stopped, let's focus on a couple of things. Obviously we've reversed the posture from the lead hand, so the pivot root goes to the back foot in this case. And as per usual, it's pointing directly at the hip point because it's bracing the hip point. It's bracing the overall strike. But you can also see something else really interesting here, that when we use oppositional force, the body will very often try to distribute its extremities so that it maximizes power. And this is an important idea because it tells us how to dynamically stack postures, or it tells us how our body knows how to dynamically stack postures itself. And we will come back to this in depth, but for now we can say that the natural doctrine of the mean is to find somewhere around about 45 degrees for the distribution, because that's equally as far forward as it is up, or equally as far back as it is down. Like propping a broom handle against a door, it's at its strongest point along both dimensions, what we call anisotropic strength, if it's at 45 degrees. But it's more accurate to say that it's not really 45 degrees that's the issue. Actually, centrifugal force would try and flatten out your posture completely if it could. And when we talk about intuitive skill, our body's intuition would try and flatten out as much as possible. It's only our will that locks it in a particular posture, that stacks the posture in a certain way. And usually 45 degrees is the absolute max that we can go before the posture starts becoming unstable and unbalanced. So it's not a magic number, it's just a law of physics. It's the anisotropic strength. It's as much up as it is forward, for example, like the broom handle against the door. So as the rotational Farley pushes us out like that, with our will, we curtail the posture. And to do that, we use hit and stop, and we use setting the posture, bracing the posture. And this is an example of oppositional force because we're opposing the centrifugal force and just locking it in place with the hit and stop. This is an example of oppositional force that isn't very often talked about in Yiquan, although Wang Shangjai does talk about it, as do several other of the old Yiquan masters. And if we look at the hook, we can see that this is actually a narrower posture, so it's not like 45 degrees is a magic number in that sense. It's a magic number in physics because it's the doctrine of the mean for the anisotropic strength between the two dimensions. The magic is in how we use our intuitive body knowledge to generate the force, but we don't allow that intuition just to take over. We use our will to stop that dead just exactly at the right point where we've stacked the posture perfectly in the doctrine of the mean between power generation and the reality and the context of the fight and what we want to do in terms of the technicalities of the posture. Talking of which, let's next look at this figure of 8 movement, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with from Tai Chi Chuan, the classic of phased movement. But here you can see really clearly the element of timing, that the throwing out of the arm has got to be timed perfectly to take maximum advantage of the force generated by that figure 8 movement. And of course in each one we call this open into close, so the figure of 8 movement in Tai Chi Chuan is really just open into close or close into open. And when we say power generation, remember that what we mean primarily is Farley, and Farley is a very small movement. A short, sharp movement, in this case round the vertical axis because we're using rotational Farley. But if we just did that, the rear arm would only move a Chinese inch, so it wouldn't be anywhere near the target. So we have to use pre-movement to get the hit point to the target, and what we do is we incorporate all of that movement into the final strike. We use it to feed into the Farley, to give it everything we possibly can to increase the power generation at that final point where we just put the zing of Farley on the end. And then again, moving beyond the idea of Farley as just some kind of abstract single thing and recognising it's a thing of multiple parts. So you have to dynamically stack the posture while you're issuing force. And one aspect that we've already looked at is the shimmy and then the lengthening of the posture across the chest. But we also need to think about how we phase the timing. It's not all one movement, so however we start the posture, when we phase it up into the movement of the arms, the shoulder's got to go back first. The shoulder goes back first very rapidly, and then the elbow of the same hand follows on with that, and then the hit point follows on with that. And it's kind of timed 1, 2, 3. Shoulder, elbow of the same arm, and then hit point. And that pulls everything round towards the striking, well, what we call the lock point. Now watch carefully as the rear hip moves forwards, but it doesn't release force. It doesn't use Farley until the last little bit of the movement gets into place, and then it releases force forwards. And that's timed exactly so that as the hip releases force forwards, the rear elbow hits the lock point, releasing force backwards. And notice very carefully that as those 2 points of the body hit the lock point, the striking part of the forearm doesn't hit the lock point at the same time. It's just slightly after that. It's like ba-dum, ba-dum. It slingshots forwards after that movement, hits the lock point, and then it hits a second lock point. So the lock point isn't actually just one moment. It's a dynamic event, and getting it right is what we call cultivation. And then, as all of that's going on, something else really interesting is going on. We are also making the posture bigger, adding more volume to the posture by using a sliding set. So look very carefully here at the movement of the feet. They're moving over in line with the punch, so they're making the posture bigger. Actually, lots of things like this happen when you do a posture with power. The feet start doing things that they don't do when you're just practicing the movement slowly. But in this case, it's a very deliberate movement to just add a little bit of volume to it. But more importantly, we're doing it to stabilise the posture, and then it's overdetermined because it just helps pull the arm round a little bit more towards our opponent's centre line. We call this a sliding set because the foot moves out and then locks into the ground. And you can see here that it's timed. Oh, remember, by the way, when I was talking about managing the centrifugal force and just stopping it dead in its tracks, that's exactly what we're doing here. But we're using the sliding set. The lead foot slides out a little bit, but you can see how it's timed exactly with the pivot root. They both bite into the floor at the same time to just root that posture, stop it absolutely dead in its tracks, literally. And then just take another closer look at the whole body movement to see how it phases, and everything phases up to the hip point with spiral force. Also notice how the pivot root pushes into the posture. You can see the line of the posture and it's pushing forwards just at that last moment. A little bit of kickback rooting into the ground and just pushing the whole posture forwards. Anything that can contribute either to power generation or to power transmission through the solidity of the hip. Next, just like the other postures, we want to start thinking about how to make the movement smaller, so erasing that little bit of pre-movement, that little bit of open, and just going straight into the posture. And one of the key ways we want to do it is emphasising this sliding set. We don't want to overdo it because then it becomes dangerous. You can slide right out of the posture, and you've got to drop your weight forwards onto it a little bit as you move into the posture, which is easy because you're leaning forwards, and the way that the torso just kind of jabs forwards and also slightly to the side towards the leg creates a compression set, or a little bit of a compression set on that lead leg, which helps solidify it, but it also makes it a risk if you go too far with it. It makes it easier to just slide out of the posture, and that will happen at times. With the worst rooting in the world and the best rooting in the world, you can still slip on something, so that will always happen at some point, no matter the level. To make this posture work, you've got to just jump into it a little bit, so you've got to lift all your weight off the floor with a little bit of a jump, an explosive movement up, and then the qua pulls the legs round to the side explosively as you land into the posture, and that's how you get around the friction from the floor so you don't damage your ankles. You can still hurt your ankles on the landing, but to get the speed, and the extra speed is going to add into the velocity, and that's going to help with the power. So you jump up a little bit, you can just see me lift off the floor. You do it with a lot of postures, but you do it very deliberately with this posture. And one of our key ways of cultivating this posture is to get more movement in the arm that isn't the striking arm, the arm that's pulling back. So explosive movement of the shoulder, and then more screwing force. And that's going to drag the whole posture around. Once we jump up in the air, that's going to pull us round much faster. But a word of warning, you can get more screwing force in this by turning the whole forearm round so that the inside of the forearm is facing outside, and that obviously is the most vulnerable part of the arm. It's the softest part, it's the part where all your important veins are on the inside of the arm and so on. And I'm never afraid to say if someone's doing something wrong, it needs correcting. My coach told me that the Yao brothers are very open-minded. It's absolutely the case that there are certain postures where Yao Cheng Rong particularly really uses a massive amount of screwing force to try and get more power in the posture, and in doing so turns the inside of his arm all the way out. I'm going to say that's wrong. Don't go beyond turning the side of your arm out. That's the maximum you want to do. The interesting thing is I've heard Yao Cheng Rong say, don't turn your arm all the way around, keep that bony part, don't get the screwing force beyond that. So it's definitely a case of do what he says, not do what he does. And similarly, I've seen video of me where I turn my arm too far out and expose that inside of the arm. So again, do as I say, not as I do. The whole point of everything we do in Yiquan is that future generations will correct our mistakes and become higher level. That's the whole dream. And then, just as with the previous postures, not just slow movement but micro movement, bringing it into standing and just visualizing, feeling the movement in your own body. This is one of the abstract elements of Yiquan practice. Standing in stillness, but nevertheless you're triggering the movement with your intent so you can actually feel it in your body. So much so, in fact, that you can feel it if you just lie down and think about the movement. But you can also take different parts of the movement and transform those into zhuangs just to train different elements of the overall posture. And at this stage, I don't think it really is all that counterintuitive to say that spending more time working on this is actually better in the long run than just trying to do the posture over and over again. You can do it hundreds and hundreds of times, but if you're just doing it hundreds of times wrong, there's no point. But if you break it down into this most micro level of movement and just restructure your movement itself, everything improves faster. This is the shortcut. Even as a former Taolu athlete, even my form's dramatically improved when I started practicing Zhanzhuang seriously. It's astonishing how well this method works.